Hello, everyone. Welcome to the JupyterLab and Jupyter Notebook weekly meeting for Friday, May 19th. And let's see here. Our meeting notes are on Dropbox paper, and looks like, not sure who should start. We have a smaller number of notes today. Does someone want to talk about the 0.22 release from yesterday?
Yeah, sure. So we're thinking more about API stability as we go into beta, basically, and there were just some outstanding bugs that were recently wrapped up. So that went into the 0.22 just to kind of have another iteration because we're getting really close to a lot of things being stable enough. But it wasn't like one of those huge, here's some new feature, go play with it releases. And Steve's been working on auditing the API just to see which things are likely to change. So this is to put stuff in that matrix that you created, Brian. And some of the ones that are going to change are, I'm not sure that they're necessarily API changes, just things on the backlog, like switching to using virtual DOM in more places. Not exactly sure where the extension system stuff is as of today, but I think there's a couple links in the docs that explain the current state of affairs there. Let's see what else. I've been working on the settings system for 1.0, and I'd originally planned to use the services API and just write stuff to the normal userland file system, and then swap those for dedicated settings APIs in the future. But that seems like it's too high a barrier for getting people to even test a PR. So instead, I'm switching to just using local storage as the backend for a setting system. But the APIs won't change. It'll just be swapping it for a different backend in the future. And Ian, you have a bunch of stuff. Would you like to talk about it?
Sure. Yeah, I've got some noise behind me, so hopefully you can hear me okay. So I've been traveling a lot the last couple weeks, so I've fallen a little behind. But one thing I've been working on the past few days is what we've talked about giving the contents manager an idea of multiple drives. And so the idea is you can add different sort of network drives, in quotes, to the contents manager and disambiguate them via the path. So hopefully within a day or two, I should have a PR open on that. I had one sort of question and comment about that list of the API stable things. So I don't know who wrote that, but one thing that I've been thinking would be useful to move from the notebook widget to the notebook model is the concept of the currently active cell. I know that in a lot of ways that's morally part of the view, but that would be something that would be useful in a real-time collaboration context to have on the model, so that you could have various UI indicators to indicate, who is currently editing a given cell. It would simplify certain things from that perspective. We have some precedent for doing that. We currently have selections living on the model for text editors, so wouldn't be crazy. And so I guess I wanted to open that up for discussion. If anybody has any thoughts on that?
And Ian, go ahead, Darren.
I was just going to ask if cursors don't already encompass enough information, right? We keep cursors, don't we? Or is that not enough?
We do keep cursors. One of the issues with tracking cursors is that it becomes really it becomes really easy to have a sort of proliferation of cursors. Every time something happens in a text editor, the code mirror says, "Hey, I got a cursor change." You try to render that cursor, and it becomes a lot easier to add cursors than remove them. So I've found you have to be really pretty aggressive about culling cursors. And one of the ways that would simplify things for me, just from an implementation standpoint, is to have a notion of which cell is currently being edited and only show cursors for that cell.
Okay, got it.
So this, in a sense, this is something that would be much simpler for implementation, but it's something that I've really has proven to be stickier than I would have thought. Is being able to aggressively remove cursors once you've added them.
Yeah.
Right.
So Ian, does this mean, am I thinking correctly about this, that the notebook model would need a list or a structure of active cells, one for each collaborator?
Not even one for each. Well, you might have two views of the same model in the same JupyterLab instance. Or those, I don't know if those are considered different collaborators or not. But I can imagine having the notebook open side by side with itself and editing two different cells.
What could it not just be the case that any cursor is born with a timer counting down to dispose itself unless something touches it again, so that these things, you don't have to keep track of them. They'll just die if they don't get updated within 30 seconds or whatever. And then you could create them as many as you want. The page will just clean up after itself, and you don't need the notion of extra metadata coming through.
Yeah, that could be a reasonable solution. I don't think this is the only possible solution, but I also know that I've had conversations with Brian and Cameron about other sort of UI indicators of what an active cell is. So this would potentially be a sort of two birds with one stone.
Oh, sure. If it gives you more capacity to build semantic features, yeah. I just meant as a technical solution, you have these things.
Yeah, as a technical solution, it's definitely not the only way to do it.
Yeah. So yeah, Ian, so in terms of what would this structure look like on the model?
So what we currently have for selections is each editor has a unique ID associated with it, and the logic is basically if the given selection or cursor is basically not local, not associated with the local editor ID, then render it.
Okay, and but so if the same would be true of some sort of active cell notion, you would have a structure that lists that in a given person's model has their own active cell and then other people's active cells, and we could choose to render the foreign non-local active cells, in some suitable way.
Yep. Yeah. So I'd be envisioning something very similar to the cursor model, which is that. Yeah.
One person could have multiple active cells.
Because they can have a notebook open twice?
They can have two views on the same model.
Yeah, I think that has to be, well, although depending on your idea of a human interacting with the system, you might say that person can only be using one of those notebooks actively at a single time. Like, yes, they could have it open, but
so it's a focused notebook view active cell.
And actually, it would be interesting to see how Google Drive handles this if you open the same doc multiple times.
So what they have is there's the concept of a user ID and a session ID, and they're separate. So the user ID is meant to be persistent is meant to be shared if the user has multiple views on the same document, and also across time. And then the session ID is meant to be unique for a given browser tab.
And they don't have the concept of multiple documents open in the same browser tab.
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely open to that. I think it would simplify some of the design and usability aspects of it, and if it simplifies your. I mean, I could imagine right now if you don't have that stuff stored on the model, that it's very difficult for you to represent that. I mean, you could like dive into the editor and see if there's a cursor in the editor for that cell and propagate that up to some notion of active, but it sounds like that's not going to be very reliable because multiple cursors are possible.
It would simplify some things, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that sounds very, very reasonable.
So
maybe
that's
the way to justify it is the model contains view state that needs to be relayed to everybody else.
Exactly, yeah. And so we already have that for cursors, and I'm at least suggesting that we do the same for active cells.
Yeah.
So what happens if I select? So I can have an active cell with no cursor, just by doing command mode. And what happens if I select multiple cells, say, in command mode? Are all those considered active, or is it just the most active one? Because we do have that notion as well.
I think the current implementation is the most active one.
Okay. But if I delete a couple of cells, right, I can imagine maybe showing that I have cells 5 through 10 selected in the UI, or maybe that gets too confusing. I don't know. But if you're not showing sort of the cells I have selected, then it might get confusing when I delete cells. There's a lot of things that we could do along this whole spectrum of the notion of what another user's state is, or
Sure.
what a view's state is.
Right. Brian, you're muted, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we do have multiple notions. We have active, selected, and multiple selected, and I don't. I think it's going to be visually too complex to represent anything but the simple active notion. Basically, the cell cursor is.
Do we currently represent text selection though? That would be the similar thing, right?
It is. I think it's just too complex in the UI to try to represent that.
I think there are platforms that do represent other people's selections, text selections.
So I have a PR open right now that does that. It just applies some CSS background color to other people's selections.
Yeah. Okay, so we're already giving the notion of what you have selected as part of a text. It's sort of, I assume that's just an extension of a cursor, right? A cursor has sort of a start and an end.
There's just a selection that has start and end in the same point.
Yeah. So you can imagine active cell being exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
I just think that
it may be too complex visual information to sort of have. I mean, you could do it like Dropbox Paper or Hackpad, I guess, did, or where you put a little icon for the person next to the cell that is active for them, and if they have multiple cells active, that way you have a quick visual understanding of who's working on what part of a notebook.
Yeah. And the other is that in practice, multiple cell selections are fairly rare compared to text selections. And so I think it's sort of over engineering for an unusual case, and also when you represent that unusual case, I think visually it's just going to be too complex for the user.
Yeah, I think we could go pretty far with just a single active selection.
Are you okay starting with that, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can naturally be extended. It's as long as our cell selections are contiguous, I think it can be pretty naturally represented in the same way we do have cursors represented in the model. Visually, yeah, we don't even have the notion of indicating to others what the current active cell is visually. So, who knows if that's going to be sort of too complex.
Okay, and then Ian, anything else you want to talk about?
That should be it for me.
Okay. Let's see. Darian? Anything else? Or one?
No.
Yeah.
I would like maybe to have people can play with next week, but if you're curious, the PR is linked and you can see where it's headed.
Okay. I've got a few small things. When I was in New York, talked with Chris a lot about the sort of the idea of having a small set of UI controls that we can reuse. And I've opened a pull request there that's linked, and the overall pattern is that and by UI controls, I'm thinking of buttons, drop downs, sliders, checkboxes, text fields, and the pattern we're thinking about is that each of these would be a function that takes an iOptions object for that object and returns a VDOM element. And the goal here would be something that, if you're laying out a panel or something that has multiple UI controls, that you can freely mix the native VDOM things with these functions and basically come up with complex layouts and have consistent styling. And so I've spent time looking sort of how are we representing buttons in current JupyterLab in a couple different places, and then consolidating it into one class. I mean, it's not a class. It's a factory function for VDOM elements that basically have the right CSS classes, etc. And I've started to work on the next is the dropdown. And the pattern that I'm thinking of is that our existing VDOM renderer class. So right now we have a VDOM model and a VDOM renderer class. And the basic picture is that the model is your state for a set, for a VDOM tree. It fired an onChange event, and then the VDOM renderer class has a render method that basically would use these UI controls and other native DOM nodes and just return a virtual DOM tree that gets rendered. And I'm thinking about us starting to use this in places basically where we don't need nested widgets. So a great example would be toolbars, cell toolbar extensions, dialogues, things like that. And then I think the logic for these components will be simplified greatly by this pattern. And also I think it'll give us reusable UI controls that we can sort of consolidate our design work, our interaction work, so we don't have to worry about fine-tuning buttons and toolbars and everything across all the different parts. The other place where I think we're quickly going to see is people building extensions and needing these core UI controls, and I think it'll really help to give people consistent UI controls that they can reuse that match styling and things like that. This is not in any way beta work, and it's probably going to shift lower on my priority as I try to work on the beta stuff, but it's something that I'll keep picking away at. The other is in doing a little bit of work, I've noticed a little bit of inconsistency about how we're making decisions about what things are in foo versus foo-extension. And in some cases, things related to the extension, like functions that add things to the command palette, are in the base NPM package, and in other places those things are in the extension. I'm not opinionated about what things go where really. I just think we probably want to audit that and make sure it's consistent for the beta. And so I don't know. I know Steve isn't here today. He probably would have comments or thoughts on that. Darian, do you have any thoughts on that or?
Yeah, I think the idea was meant to be all the things that you would consider putting in any other npm package that is meant to be used on its own. You put that in the core, and you put only the things that are JupyterLab specific. So, for example, that's where you add commands because your command IDs aren't something you're going to export, and that's where you create an instance and create an instance tracker if the core class is the thing that you want to keep track of within JupyterLab. So I think we have guidance on it. I actually think there probably won't be much disagreement if we audit it and we find some things that look out of place. I'm just not sure we've been hyper vigilant about it, and maybe that's what's happened.
Okay, we should touch base with Steve once he's back.
Cool, yeah.
And then the last thing I'll add a note is I've got another PR open that is refactoring our, in master right now, we have a default theme package. And that includes both our theme assets, such as images and icons, and then also our default theme CSS variables. And I'm splitting that into multiple pieces. So there's going to be a theme assets package that has only the assets. And then a theme itself would be an extension that just has the CSS variables. And that model is fairly simple. The only other place where this is going to affect us is we're going to need to turn off the extract. Basically, the Webpack plugin that extracts CSS files into a separate file. We'll need to disable that because we need the usual workflow is going to be a user would have multiple themes installed, but all but one disabled. And if we use the extract files plugin, the CSS for all of the installed plugins would get loaded on the page even if they're disabled. And so we need to make sure that when a theme is disabled, its CSS is not loaded onto the page. It may be possible using clever regular expressions for us to still use the extract plugin on everything else, like all the core modules of JupyterLab, and only not do this on themes. So that may be a possibility. And I think this, from talking to different folks, it sounds like the themability of JupyterLab is probably beta material. There's a number of people who want to, I think, immediately start to use JupyterLab, but the first thing that they would do would be to theme it, and so I think that's probably beta level work. That's all I have. Jason, want to say a few things about it?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of activity, a bunch of PRs merged. And in particular, we had a bunch of new contributors from the hackathon, as well as some other people that have contributed some code. We're down to a handful of PRs that are open, with a couple more handful of issues open for 7.0. We put out a new alpha testing out the extension system for JupyterLab 0.22, and it was great. It was just a matter of updating my dependencies and recompiling, and worked wonderfully. Yeah, we're pushing forward to probably a beta of 7.0.
Okay. The only one thing I forgot. The only thing we ran into in doing the extension stuff is that I think we can fill out the. Or first, I'll say what Jason said was also true for us in like the new extension system has worked fantastic. Building extensions based on the cookie cutters working, like everything just worked. The only thing we ran into is I think we can improve the documentation of the command line programs. Like a number of don't have any documentation beyond the default traitlets auto-generated stuff. And I can submit a pull request on that. I think that'll help people, things like I stumbled over the fact that JupyterLab extension list didn't list my linked extensions, and that there's a separate list linked subcommand, and and that list linked command isn't listed. It was hard to find that command existed. So, but everything worked fantastic. So that was the only thing I ran into. I don't know. Chris, anything from the Phosphor side?
Yeah, still working, trying to rapidly get out read-only grid release as soon as possible. I made some pretty big performance improvements this week when there are multiple grids on the screen. So previously what I was doing is that as a grid was resized, the canvas that was being used as the surface to draw on was resized to exactly match the size of the viewport. And it turns out that's fine when there's only one grid on the screen, but as you get more of them on the screen, it turns out that the resizing the canvas, I'm assuming due to the memory reallocations under the covers, actually gets pretty expensive. So what I did was I changed to allowing that canvas to only grow in increments of 512 pixels, which would be like somewhat, anecdotally an optimum. And what that means is that as you start expanding the grid viewport, the canvas under the covers will expand, but it's never going to shrink again. So once you maximize your browser window or something like that, the underlying canvases will never again be resized, and so everything remains quite speedy. So you can actually do the interactive drag and drop resizing, and it doesn't slow anything down. So that was a big performance win on top of all the other stuff that we're doing for performance. So now I'm hooking up the actual logic to handle the various change signals from the data models. So if the data model inserts rows or remove rows, those kinds of things. And then after that, I'll whip together a quick JSON-based data model, and I think I'm ready to cut the read-only release.
That's really exciting, I think. So when you talk about a JSON-based data model, what are you thinking there?
I don't know. I've looked at the JSON table schema stuff, and I have something that is designed to work easily with that JSON table schema, but the JSON table schema doesn't, as far as I can see, doesn't specify a format that the data itself is actually stored in. It's just metadata about a particular data set. So I'm not entirely sure. I just haven't solved that problem yet. I just haven't put anything into it. So whether it's going to be whether I'm going to assume the data is columnar or whether I'm going to assume it's row based or something else, I haven't decided yet.
Yeah.
Happy to take input if you have some data sets you're wanting to.
Honestly, I'm wondering if it would make sense to support the different JSON export modes that Pandas supports. It has, 3 different modes, I think. One is columnar, so key is column name, value is columns. Another is row-based, where each row is basically a list of dictionaries. It may make sense to just support those formats. I mean, and part of it is each of the formats is great for certain things and horrible for others. And either that or have one sort of optimal in-memory format and then simple converters between the formats or something like that. But in my mind, those are going to be the main formats that we would get tabular data in.
Okay. So are you doing any work at all with the JSON table schema?
Me personally, not yet. And I don't know. Yeah, I have not yet.
Okay.
And this is where, it may make sense to touch base with the Pandas folks. I mean, are we thinking that an initial target for this would be like data frame type things?
I mean, that's going to really be up to whatever the user of the library does, because like presumably your data frame is going to live on your server, not on the client, and so like that's more or less out of my purview. So I don't want to make anything that's like, here's I'm not gonna bake into Phosphor the concept of the pandas data frame. Like that's out of scope.
Yeah.
But if we can find out, hey, most things are going to have data in this type of format or something, then then maybe if I can find a suitably general enough format where you can just shove some in-memory data into a data model, then I'll do that. But again, the idea is that people are going to implement for their particular use cases, their own implementations of data models that do what they need. And so for JupyterLab's case, like, yeah, we might have some implementations of data models that have the concept of pandas data frame because that's used all over the place. But for Foster, I think that would be out of scope to cater directly to pandas.
Yeah. And unfortunately, in my experience, the abstraction of a 2D data structure into JSON data, I wish there was one way that everyone was doing it, but that's not the case. Like I see the different possibilities regularly. Row-oriented, column-oriented. And even, part of what's a little bit messy is, sometimes when it's row-oriented, the rows are dictionaries and not an ordered sequence. And so the keys would be the column labels, and the values would be the data for that row and column. The difficulty there is that the ordering you have to refer to another structure that has the ordering of the column names. And so you have a sort of a double lookup to figure out, what is the second column, find its name, and then index into the row and the column by the name of the column. That's a very common format.
Wow, that's also a very slow format.
It is. Well, and where it's, I think, probably better is for group by operations where the ordering doesn't matter, and you're basically wanting to do, that style of computation. And so this is where I think this is why in the wild you see all the different options, is because each of them are, it's sort of like sparse matrix formats. The reason there's multiple is that they're optimal for different types of algorithms. But I think it's reasonable for you to pick a data model a basic JSON data model that is, optimal for your usage case. Like I guess, so your data model, your JSON data model will have to include the header rows and column, or the column and row headers separately.
sorry, I muted myself. Since the data model is completely virtual, including getting the data for the headers, like it can be stored however you want it to be stored for a given implementation. So,
but your concrete JSON model will have to somehow represent that.
yeah, sure, for some definition of representation. The other thing is that I've got a concept of a field in the data model, which is per column, because lots of data is columnar oriented, and most times that you want to do custom cell renders, it's going to be based on a per column basis.
Right.
Field is a pair, which is a name and a type, and it maps directly to the concept of a field in JSON table schema, which maps also well onto SQL and other sorts of things. And that name and type is can be used to dispatch to look up custom cell renders that can handle columns of a given name or columns of a given type, or a combination of the two, or lack thereof. And so, it may be useful to have the base JSON data model include that notion that, hey, like I've got columns and they have this name and this type, and so if people can get their data into that format, then we can actually, be more intelligent about how we render it, or at least give you the option. Just some more stuff to think about.
Yeah. How do you?
The trick is going to be having a default data model that people don't expect is the end-all be-all data model. That, oh, when we use the data grid, we use this data model. Like, we need to be real careful about the messaging. This is just an example of a data model that suits one particular use case. Like, the real data model is completely abstract and virtual, and you can implement it however you want.
Right.
Because I've seen that go awry at other places. Like, somebody ends up writing a reasonably complete data model, and then that is now the data model, and nobody ever writes another one ever. And it's, it ends up being not great at everything.
Yeah, and actually that may be reason for Phosphor to ship with at least 2 data models, just to emphasize that fact, even if they're very simple ones, just to sort of, in many cases, the n=1 to n=2 abstraction difference is the key one that lets people see, oh wow, like that's possible. But yeah, if your data model already, your abstract data model already includes the notion of the fields, I think a columnar oriented concrete model would be very reasonable as a starting point. And I think that would be, yeah. So Chris, how do you dispatch to renderers when you don't have fields declared?
So the only other option is, so you register renderers by, right now, three properties. So the region, and the region is either the body, the row header, the column header, or the corner header. And then 2 optional parameters, which is the field name and the field type. And if you don't provide those, they're wildcards. So, anything, other things can match. Like, so basically, if you register a cell renderer for just the body region and you don't provide a field name and a field type, then any cell that I get that doesn't find a more specific renderer in the body will use that one body renderer. And so ultimately, if you have a data model that doesn't provide any field names and any field types, then you're going to get that one cell renderer that you've registered for the body, and it's going to handle everything. Now, if you wanted to, the only logical thing at that point is that if you wanted to dispatch based on, row and column index or what have you, then that particular cell renderer could do that dispatching inside its paint method, where it gets the row and the column that it's painting for. So when the paint method of the cell renderer gets called, it's passed a config object, which contains row index, column index, the bounding box that it's drawing into, the data value, that sort of thing. And if it wants to delegate to some other internal renderer that it has mapped in a special way, then it can do that. The reason that I didn't include mapping by row and column index in the data grid is because your data model might insert and remove rows or columns in the course of its lifetime. And then what does the data grid do at that point? Does it shift the mapped cell renderers that are based on row and column index? What if you remove the row for the thing that you have a cell renderer for? And so it's better to not have that mapping be done on row and column index at that level. And if you've got some weird case where you've got a fixed grid and the dimensions are always the same, and you can do that index-based mapping, then you still have an escape hatch to do that with a custom renderer. It's just not a default use case I'm going to support.
Yeah, no, that's part of the nightmare of Excel is what are the semantics of the grid when you add and remove rows, and the formatters, the equations, all that stuff. And and there's a lot of usability bugs that Excel continues to have because of all those edge cases. So that, I think it makes sense to not bake that into the renderers itself.
Yeah, and that same problem occurs when you start talking about where in the pipeline do you introduce the concept of spans, like row and column spans? Is that a concept that lives on the data grid, or is it a concept that lives on the data model? Because the same question happens if you start talking about you inserted and removed rows. Same thing with borders too. If you draw borders on another layer, then they need to be aware of cell spans and so on. And so there's some lingering issues there that will come up as we start to add more features after the read-only release.
Okay, fantastic. All right. It looks like we're through all of our notes and we're through our hour. So is there anything else we should cover before we say goodbye to the internet? All right. Well, with that, we'll end the meeting. Bye.